Welcome to the new online talk series of the European Vegan Summit. My name is Lena Anna Kuklińska, and I'm a volunteer at the Green Roof Institute, the organizer of the European Vegan Summit, the first and only vegan think tank in Poland, and the operator of the Future Food for Climate Coalition. European Vegan Summit is the very first event of this kind in Europe, a place where activists, politicians, business people, and academics meet on one stage to connect the dots on the map of human rights protection, environmental rights protection, and animal rights protection. Its first edition took place in September 2022, and currently the second, larger edition is being prepared for 2023. Today, I have the pleasure to host Dr Miłka Stępień, the newest member of the Green Roof Institute's expert board, Just Transition coordinator at the CEE Bankwatch Network, and climate activist. She was a panelist at the first edition of the European Vegan Summit, speaking on the global policies, the role of trade agreements, and the importance of looking at the other parts of the world while considering even European policies and strategies. Welcome, Miłka. It is a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
We meet here today to talk about COP27 and COP15, two events that have been making the headlines for the past couple of weeks. COP27 finished approximately 3 weeks ago. COP15 is currently ongoing. So without further ado, Miłka, please tell me, what comes to mind when you hear COP27? What is the first thing that you think of?
I think a lot of things. I've participated in two so far. I didn't actually participate in this one. I participated in the one in Glasgow last year and the one in Katowice a few years ago. And I think that in both cases, many of us climate activists were expecting much more. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is a feeling of it's not going far enough, considering the climate catastrophe that is ongoing. For me, I lived in Africa for many years, and I also have a PhD in African literature. So for me, the Global South is very close. And this is another thing that comes to mind for me, that in many ways, the countries that are experiencing the climate catastrophe right now at this moment to the highest degree are fighting very much at the various COPs to have their needs and problems noted and to receive support and help. And while there is a lot of discussion about it, it's still not at the level and degree that it should be.
I see. And from your perspective on a just climate transition in all areas, I think it links to what you said, that like the focus is very selective, and it also comes to the topics that are being discussed, because as much as we're happy to have the discussions on the energy transition or transformation, the decision makers are still very selective in what they are actually talking about at COPs and in general. For instance, they are leaving out the importance of changing the broken food system and agriculture. When do you think, or is it even possible for the decision makers to actually stop being so selective? And will they ever want to look at the problem and notice that we cannot fix the problem of the climate change just by looking at one or two areas?
I think there are certain decision makers that are slowly getting there, but even I work primarily on energy transformation, and in this field, for example, we can see that for the European Union, we have clear activities towards phasing out coal. But in the energy transformation sector, which is one that has garnered a lot of interest, there are also selective areas. So right now, because also NGOs focused a lot on fighting coal in the first instance, now we are dealing with the issue of gas that is returning. So in this way, it's selective because, you know, we fight off one element, we have achievements within one field, And then it turns out that you have to have another sort of struggle and fight to exclude the next element. So I would say that in a lot of the other areas, there is ongoing work. So you have certain initiatives that are linked, for example, to transport, linked to global trade, linked to agriculture, to saving biodiversity, but it's not going fast enough. And I think for climate activists, it's especially ones that are dealing like me with policy and trying to push decision makers forward. It's very hard because on the one hand, we realize that at the current pace that we're going with the current approach that we have, we're heading towards 2.4 degrees by 2100. Every time we see certain steps forward, we have 2 steps back somewhere else. So even with emissions, carbon emissions, we're not really seeing the drop that we should, because of the largest emitters are not committing, even within the scope that is being pushed the most intensely, which is energy transformation. On the other hand, because we work on policy, we know how complex it is from the inside to actually push such processes forward. And we have seen that the discussion has sped up in recent years, but we know it's not going fast enough. So how to deal with this? I don't know. I mean, the only thing we can do is just continue pushing to speed up even more. And you asked the question when. I think the initial discussion is currently in place, but it's going to take even more for it to become something that is like the mainstream topic. And I agree with you completely that if we look at climate change, it's not enough to solve one issue. We need to solve a whole variety of issues. So except for the political problems, so the way that our system works is very complex. It's extremely bureaucratic. It takes a long time to make any decisions, to find finances, to move forward. We also have social backlashes and people being against changes. This is usually because they don't realize what the consequences of inaction will be in the next years. So we live in a world of abundance. We live in a world of comfort. And people do not realize that this is in danger at the moment. And they think that if they continue to fight for their comfort and the current state of things, that it'll just remain that way. So it's really hard to explain to people that if you don't start lowering, let's say, changing certain things, if not you, then at least your children will have a much, much worse level of living, quality of life, because they will be living in a world where weather anomalies are a complete norm, where it's impossible to function in some parts of the world, which is already true in a lot of parts of the world, right? We don't hear a lot about that in Europe, and I definitely think not enough. But it's also really hard for people to make people realize that that if something is happening going on in Palau or I don't know, Malawi in Africa or somewhere else, or in Indonesia, that this is something that will happen in the future also in our part of the world. So because it's far away, people don't see it as personal. And I think this is one of the huge issues, because we're seeing a lot of backlash also against energy transformation and agriculture. I think it actually in many ways should be easier, because people do care about what they eat. They do notice that the quality of food in many ways is lowering, that vegetables and fruit do not have the same nutrition value, that they are frequently contaminated, that generally it's much harder to eat well at the moment. People do know about animal rights. So the issue is how to get to that moment when they start applying it to their own lives, and think more about quality of life and the future of their kids, for example, than about making money, which is the big issue, because the whole discussion is about economy in many ways. So when I discuss energy transformation with decision makers or businessmen, you have to give economic argumentation to convince them. So we have to get to a moment where well, you have to present it in a way that they will understand, but at the same time, in the future, this economic backlash, this crisis of the economy will be increased because of climate crisis. And I think many people also don't realize that. So they say we can't do something because of the economy. And what we have to keep reminding them is that if we don't do this, there will be no economy. So it's a really hard discussion, and it's a constant pushing backwards and forwards. But I do think there is movement forward. Unfortunately, I think COP27 wasn't one of those. So it was a few small successes, and I think a lot of disappointment for many people who expected more.
I see. And I mean, it is indeed a very complex situation. And whenever money is involved, I think a lot of different reasoning just gets shut off, because ultimately money just runs the world right now. And because of that, people just don't want to listen to other arguments that might be a bit more human as well when it comes to like bringing in the human factor. But I'm just thinking, because you mentioned the societal pressure as well, which has to be there indeed. But of course, no matter how much pressure we exert, ultimately it is up to the decision makers and people who have the resources to introduce the change. And I'm thinking, because at this year's COP, numerous celebrities, politicians, climate activists, NGOs, including Green Ref Institute, called on the world leaders to support the plant-based treaty, which has been signed by hundreds of people. And nothing essentially happened with that, even though it showed that people want this document to be introduced and respected and to bring the change they are asking for. So I'm thinking, when is the moment when like pressure is pressure like down, like bottom up pressure ever enough? When will the world leaders take such proposals like the plant-based treaty seriously?
I think it can be very effective, but it has to be very targeted. One of the issues, I think, with COP27 is that there's a lot of things going on there over the course of 2 weeks. And it's really hard to sort of break through the amount of things that people are trying to get signed or things like that. I think advocacy and pressuring is something that needs to be done long term, and with a very, very specific plan about how to do it. I mean, in the case of let's say something that would be based on a revision of agriculture, a lot of would have to do with the European level policy that is related to that, and primarily where the funding goes. Okay, so what is financed, what isn't financed, what receives funding, what doesn't receive funding, what is acceptable according to requirements for funding, and what isn't, what is supported. Okay, so another aspect that needs to be changed is taxes. So obviously, one of the things that hasn't been introduced yet to the level that it should is the sort of tax approach that everything that is harmful to the environment or to the climate is more highly taxed than something that is pro-climate and pro-environment. And in this way, we can impact the way in which our economy works. Because at the moment, a lot of the financial support still goes to polluting entities, both within the scope of agriculture, but also in industry, etc. If you actually had an economy which was based on how good a product, for example, is for the environment, this would substantially change the way that the world functions. Because if eco-friendly products or climate-friendly industries were supported to a higher extent, then it would just make people would just buy it and use it, right? And I mean, this is simple and it's been introduced in various ways in other forms in other areas. And it still has to sort of be extended to a lot of other areas, transport and agriculture, for example. For energy, a system like this was the ETS system, right? So you have the EU ETS system, which is basically, well, in some forms, a taxation or a price on emissions, basically. And if you introduce something like this, it adds additional pressure to back out of something that is economically unviable. So if you look at how the agricultural system is also financed, what you usually have is that it's not necessarily the environmentally and ecologically best solutions that receive funding. And we have this throughout Europe. Until it actually changes that, you know, the funding is received by farms and areas which are trying to retain biodiversity, which are trying to support ecological farming, etc., then nothing will change because the funding is still going into the wrong places. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Yes, it does. I mean, we go back to the argument that, well, money sadly runs everything. And what you said about the people, the consumers, would change their patterns of like economical behavior if they only saw it as more beneficial. But for many people, also those who care about the environment, they cannot afford, for instance, healthy food, ethical food, because it's just more expensive, because the products that are polluting, or their production is polluting the earth, or that are just more harmful to the environment in general, to the biodiversity, that come from factory farming, for instance, they just receive subsidies that from the governments, from the EU, that essentially make them cheaper. And people who cannot afford, and especially now in many countries we are seeing a big inflation and just poor economic situation because of many reasons, because of the pandemic, because of the war in Ukraine, people just cannot afford food that they should be eating for their health, for the planet, for the animals, because yes, the products are simply more expensive, and we cannot expect somebody who cannot pay their bills to buy something that's healthier, ethical, or more ecologically friendly just because they simply cannot. So this is sadly the truth, and that's why I think the pressure that many activists are exerting, so just trying to change the policies and are lobbying for that. That's like that's a key effort that the people are making. So yeah.
So the key moments to come in are basically when policy is being prepared, and this is what a lot of organizations actually do. I think the main problem with COP is that a lot of what is decided there is not followed through on. So it doesn't have a strong binding force. And until it does have strong binding force and strong commitment from, for example, the largest emitters or the most extensively destructive countries, then it's not going to be really successful. We do see actually a lot of positive coming out from the European Union. So the EU actually did push for a lot of more stringent policies. But I would like to go back to this issue of the money. So if you look at the energy sector, it's interesting to note, for example, how strongly subsidied coal used to be. The reason we're actually transitioning right now is because within the new policy, you're not allowed to subsidize coal. Generally, no funding will be provided from the European Union for any coal investments, whether it's production, distribution, whatever. So this has basically led to a situation in which it's economically unviable to retain coal. This is also linked, of course, to the fact that we're basically running out of also the raw materials, right? So this shows that how strong this type of instrument can be in changing the whole situation. Another example of this is actually the huge increase in heat pumps and PV installations this year, which was linked to the rising prices of gas linked to the war in Ukraine. So people started investing in PV and heat pumps because it became economically viable. It made sense. And I agree with you completely that, you know, one of the largest problems that we have contemporarily is that in terms of food and agriculture, is that the cheapest food is highly processed, unhealthy, and usually also very much based on this type of animal farming that is absolutely disgusting. And this is the cheapest food that you can get. So not only is it harmful from the perspective of, you know, animal ethics and what it's doing to the animal world, it's also unhealthy for human beings because they receive high amounts of antibiotics, high amounts of hormones, and generally it's just unhealthy to eat such type of meat, even though it's extremely popular and very cheap. But we are not yet at the point where people understand these connections, or let's say broader society doesn't understand these connections, because I'm sure that people linked to the European Vegan Summit do. But if you talk to people, let's say in a broader social context, they don't see those connections to that extent. They're happy to eat something that is cheap. They don't think that they are being manipulated by various companies into thinking that what they're eating is healthy. People don't believe that such things would be made available to eat by our governments, by companies. We are trusting in that way, I think. So I think this is a huge issue, that the laws in place actually don't work because they do not protect our children. They do not protect us. We are eating things that are killing us.
Exactly. And I think I was one of those people who actually just bought anything thinking that, well, but the EU wouldn't put it on the market if it was harmful, but that's very not true. But it boils down to just educating oneself, or being exposed to information, actually taking it in, because it's also the problem that we are nowadays. We are just surrounded by a lot of conflicting pieces of information, and it's very hard to make sense of what is happening and what we are taught. And sadly, schools are also not providing us with the tools to make sense of all of this. So it's also key to the work of the activists and organizations that are actually trying to educate us on what's happening around us and what we are actually paying for, and where our taxes are going to, because that's also a big
this
issue.
is definitely I think it's very sad that we can't trust the institutions that were created to ensure our safety. So this is I think let's say the global consumer market is probably one of the places where we can best see business as usual approach. So we know that transportation over large distances is harmful to the environment, and yet this continues on. We know that a lot of the food that is on the market shouldn't even be allowed to be sold to people because it causes cancer and other illnesses, and yet it's allowed. So this is where I think if we look at food, actually, this is like a huge issue in terms of trust in institutions, public institutions that should be taking care of us. It also shows how companies function. So it's very frequently people even working within these companies are not do not fully connect all the dots. So I've talked with people, for example, working in herbicide and pesticide companies. And one person that I talked to mentioned that he himself doesn't eat such food. He only eats ecological food. At the same time, what he was doing was selling and making sure that more of this was on the market. So people don't connect the dots between what they are doing themselves, the companies that they work for, and how this impacts the climate, the environment, our health, etc. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. But when you were saying about like how the companies they benefit of us not connecting the dots, and I wanted to bring it back to COP27. Who do you think is the biggest winner of the event, and who's the biggest loser? Because we mentioned already that was a big disappointment, but ultimately, can we name who actually benefits of COPs? Because activists yearly say that they know it will be a disaster, they know it won't satisfy them, they know it won't be enough, and the agreements made won't be enough. Yet they keep being organized, and people go to COPs, and they keep trying to pretend that something is happening. So who actually benefits of these events?
I'm not sure if benefit is a good sentence word. I mean, it's not. I'm not sure if it's about basically. I'm not sure if there are any winners because we do have a climate catastrophe, so it's impossible for there to be any winners. I think that some countries did manage to push for certain solutions that will be helpful. I think that the Just Transition Partnership for Indonesia is definitely a good step forward. At the same time, I'm always worried about the extent to which this will actually be implemented and the finances will be sent to Indonesia, because we had very similar, let's say, partnerships or agreements made during COP26. For example, there was a 100 billion goal for, let's say, climate support to the global south, and it still hasn't been achieved. So this is, I think, a very bad sign because climate catastrophe is very much global. We cannot pretend that if we change everything in the European Union, that's going to be enough. It's about these transportation chains. It's about, like, for example, if we switch the EU to 100% renewables, and this isn't done in other countries, it won't matter. So the EU at the moment is sort of the leading in sort of a planned transition, but it's not enough. We need all of the countries on board, and I think this is the biggest problem with the COP, that we don't have all of the countries on board, especially the big countries that are the highest emitters. And that are also the most problematic in terms of questions of, unsustainable agriculture, have huge amounts of transportation and trade going on, which adds to the climate crisis, and that are not really taking care of the issue of biodiversity. So, I mean, we have a number of different crises going on. Polycrisis is what they call it at the moment, right? So we just came out of COVID. We have the Ukraine war, which has impacted prices around the world. We have an economic crisis. We have a biodiversity crisis. So we have, the sixth the sixth extinction, basically, which will signify that by 2050 we will have very little wildlife left if we stay on the same path. We have the climate crisis. We have the waste crisis, right? So these are we are at a point in time that if we don't make huge changes, we are not going to have much of a world to live in a few decades. So like I said, it's hard for me to talk about winners. Who are the biggest losers of COP27? I think it's the same as most of the previous years. This is the global south, or countries that are struggling already with climate consequences. Pacific islands that are going underground, countries that have had droughts for decades almost, others which are experiencing tornadoes and hurricanes. Why are they the losers? This is mostly because they are not receiving the support that they need, and even the declarations are not at the level that they should be. So COP27 isn't introducing enough support.
And should we be optimistic when you think about the next year's COP, or do you think it will essentially remain the same?
I can give my personal opinion. I'm not sure. I think the COP is an important event, but something needs to change. And I'm not sure how to achieve this. I mean, we heard at a certain point during COP27 that the UN commissioner himself was pushing for increased ambitions during the COP27. He was basically telling the countries off that they should be moving forward on promises and fulfilling the expectations that people have. And until we see a real commitment by especially the largest emitters, the COPs are not going to be achieving what we need from them. So we have to be there to continue pushing. I hope that at some point there will be sort of, I could see this in the energy transformation conversation, that at a certain point it was like a little switch had been pushed, and that suddenly it was much easier to talk about these things with different decision makers. It was much easier to push forward on this. It was like you passed through this magic sort of gate that you didn't realize was there, and that when you passed the gate, it was just easier to push these things forward. So this is what has happened in Europe. I'm not sure to what extent it can happen on the global scale, but I think in the future we will have even more crises. I think the economic crisis will get worse. I think the energy crisis will also become worse because we're not moving forward enough or fast enough in terms of transitioning. You are going to have an increased amount of dissatisfaction and problems in the global south. So all of these things together will lead to us reaching this point where it's not going to be a choice to do something about it. Basically, the countries are going to be forced to do it because there will be no other way. I think it's a shame that we're not preparing ahead of that. Because, basically, we could have started climate adaptation and mitigation and all activities that were aimed at saving our climate and our environment 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because we had the scientific knowledge then. but we decided to wait until almost the last minute, which is now. And I hope we are not going to wait until that very last minute when it might be too late.
I very much hope so too, because I very much agree when you were talking before about how we're essentially sacrificing the future of our children. I'm very much aware that my children, their lives won't be as easy as mine has been up until now. We discussed COP27, and currently there is also COP15 going on biodiversity. I don't know if you followed it, but I'm just wondering, if so, do you think it's because it focuses on something more narrow, or maybe not? At least it seems so to me. And I'm thinking whether it's actually maybe the smaller COP that fewer people care about, but one that actually gets more things done. What's your opinion on that?
It's easy to write things on paper. It's much more difficult to actually have them implemented, which is probably what I have the most problem with the COPs, right? So there's a lot of great things written on paper, but they're not necessarily later followed through on, or only to a certain extent. So I think with the COP15, which is on biodiversity in Montreal happening at the moment, it's a sort of a similar situation. So the push is right now for 30% of terrains basically put under complete protection, which is actually not that much, but from the climate perspective, it's a bare minimum. At the same time, what we've already had in the past as results, let's say from these biodiversity COPs, is that there have been statements about growing the amount of protected areas and providing more support for indigenous peoples that are frequently, they live frequently in areas with the highest level of biodiversity and natural areas. This has been put in place in terms of what is written down. In practice, very frequently, this is only on paper. So you have protected areas that are not fully protected. You have protected areas that continue to undergo degradation. And we see this in Europe all the time as well. I think even Poland is a good example, where you have semi-protected areas or reservations that are where the trees are being cut down. You have Natura 2000 sites, which are like, basically in Poland, Natura 2000 is treated as this very vague thing that nobody has to follow. Right? So I live next to a Natura 2000 area, and this is a habitat for water birds and animals. And a few years ago, we have this lowland over there that's right next to the river. It was sold to a farmer, and he cut out all the reeds next to the river. So this is how biodiversity protection is treated in many places, not only in Poland or in Europe. We know what was happening in Brazil with the cutting down of the Amazon forest during Bolsonaro's presidency. And we know also what was happening with the indigenous peoples there. So for me, I will be able to say that COP27 or COP15, the biodiversity COP15 in Montreal, are a success if we actually see results. So if we see the amount of actually protected areas increasing, and in the case of the climate COP, if we see the global emissions falling, because we're not seeing that yet.
Miłka, thank you very much for your answers and for your time and expertise. It was a pleasure to listen to your thoughts on COPs. And I hope that if in a year time, when we maybe meet to discuss COP28, we will have reflections on how much has been done during the year and how much was implemented actually, not really how much has not been done. But yes, thank you again. It was a pleasure.
Well, I mean, you did ask me about COPs. I'm actually not that negative in a lot of other fields. So, for example, I work on just transition. So we are just having the approvals of just transition plans throughout Europe. This week, the Polish just transition plans were approved. And this is a huge step forward because it's basically a plan about how to reach climate neutrality within a few years. And I think it's a huge step forward. I just know that, you know, the things that I'm doing, let's say on the local, regional, or European level are only a small drop within what we need to do globally. But I know that there are a lot of activists throughout the world, you know, working in different fields that are pushing this forward. And I think if we have anything to sort of say is a success, it's very much thanks to activists, to people who are out on the streets and protesting, because we wouldn't have had the changes in the European Union that we have right now if it wasn't for youth protests, for example, before the COVID epidemic. So despite maybe sounding a bit negative throughout what I was saying, I do see hope, but it has to be pushed forward even faster. And we have to make sure that things don't stay just on paper. We have to be there to monitor how funds are being spent, how policies are being written, who is taxed, and how what kind of things are allowed into sale, for example. And I know you guys do a lot of this stuff, so I look forward to our further cooperation, you in the field of agriculture and food and biodiversity, me in the field of energy transformation, because I agree with you completely. We can't look at things selectively.
I am very happy that we're finishing this talk on this note, and I warmly encourage our audience to share, comment their thoughts on this year's COPs, but also on what has been said on the negative and the positive, because we ultimately got a mix of both. And from my side, I would like to encourage everybody to follow the European Vegan Summit and Green Roof Institute on all social media platforms to stay up to date with the new episodes in our monthly series, and to learn, to be the first one to learn about the next edition of the European Vegan Summit. We'll be releasing new information very soon. Thank you and have a good evening or a good day wherever you are right now.